Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the American frontier. So, take a breath, dim the lights, and settle into the pillow, because we're stepping through those swinging saloon doors of the Wild West. The ones that never seem to fit properly, creak just enough to be annoying, and always look far more glamorous in movies than they ever did in real life. Now, when you picture a saloon, maybe you imagine polished mahogany bars, chandeliers dripping with glass, and poker tables where mysterious men in wide-brimmed hats slap down cards with a flourish. And yes, some of that did exist. If you were in a prosperous boomtown or in Hollywood, but mostly, a saloon was a wooden box that smelled like sawdust, whiskey, and unwashed miners. The glamour was mostly splinters. And then there was the food, which, let's be honest, is not what people think about when they hear Wild West Saloon. You don't picture spaghetti bolognese being served alongside a gunfight. But, like all humans, cowboys, miners, and drifters still had to eat. The question is, what exactly was on the menu? The short answer is beans. Lots of beans. If you imagine a steaming plate of baked beans plopped down with little enthusiasm, congratulations. You've captured about half of the frontier diet. Beans were cheap, durable, and came in enormous sacks that could survive the journey across deserts and mountains. They were also endlessly dull, which explains the gallons of hot sauce, onions, and pork fat people tried to throw in just to make them edible. But saloons weren't only about beans. In the more prosperous towns, especially where railroads delivered supplies, you could find surprisingly varied food. Oysters, for example, were all the rage. Yes, oysters. Picture some poor cowboy in dusty boots sitting down to a plate of slippery shellfish, pretending this was sophistication. They were shipped in barrels packed with ice, traveling thousands of miles from the East Coast. Naturally, by the time they arrived, the oysters were, well, let's just say they had developed character. Yet people still ate them, because nothing says civilized like risking food poisoning in the middle of Nevada. And then there was steak. Lots of steak. The frontier had cattle, and when you have cattle, you inevitably have steak. Though depending on the cow's age, condition, and whether it had just wandered out of a dust storm, the steak might be less juicy sirloin and more chewing exercise. Still, slap enough salt and lard on it, and it counted as a hearty meal. Bread was another staple, though it was rarely soft or fluffy. Frontier bread was often sourdough, which was practical, since yeast was difficult to transport and sourdough kept regenerating itself. The result was dense, tangy loaves that could also double as blunt weapons in bar fights if necessary. Vegetables were a different matter. If you lived in a boomtown in the middle of nowhere, the chance of seeing a fresh carrot was about as likely as seeing a unicorn. Most vegetables came dried or pickled, which is why frontier cuisine often tasted like vinegar with a side of despair. Cabbage, onions, and potatoes were the most common, because they lasted longest without turning into compost. A boiled potato might not sound thrilling, but compared to month-old pickled cucumbers, it was practically a delicacy. Of course, saloons weren't exactly fine dining establishments. Most of them served what was called a free lunch. You'd buy a drink, usually something terrifying like rock-gut whiskey, and you got a free plate of food. The catch was that the food was heavily salted. Ham, pickles, crackers, cheese. So you'd be forced to buy another drink and then another. Essentially, the free lunch was the world's earliest bar scam, designed to turn you into both a loyal customer and dangerously dehydrated. And then there was coffee. Cowboy coffee was not the carefully ground, ethically sourced, artisanal brew you might find in a modern cafe. No, this was boiled water with fistfuls of coarse grounds thrown in, simmered until it could strip the lining off your stomach. If you were lucky, the cook would throw in an eggshell or two to help settle the grounds. If you weren't lucky, you ended up drinking a liquid that was part coffee, part mudslide, part existential regret. Dessert, surprisingly, was sometimes available. Dried fruit pies, usually made with apples or peaches that had been shriveled within an inch of their lives. Sugar was expensive, so pies were often tart, which was a polite way of saying sour enough to make your jaw ache. But again, when your daily meals were beans and salted pork, even a half-rotten peach pie could feel like a miracle. Now, what about alcohol? Because let's be honest, that was the main attraction of saloons. Whiskey was the drink of choice, though whiskey is perhaps too generous a term. Much of it was raw alcohol, sometimes flavored with tobacco juice, pepper, or whatever was lying around. If you were really unlucky, it might be partly kerosene. The point was less to savor and more to survive until the next hand of poker. Beer also existed, but without refrigeration, it was often warm, sour, and flat. Still, it was safer than the water, which usually contained bonus bacteria. So, picture a dusty saloon. Men slumped over rough tables, chewing on beans, drinking whiskey that doubled as paint stripper, and occasionally daring each other to eat an oyster that had survived a 3-week train journey. That, more than the glamorous Hollywood image, was the reality of Wild West cuisine. But let's drift a little further, because saloon food is just one part of the broader history of unfortunate dining. Royal courts, for example, had their own versions of questionable menus. In the medieval period, kings and queens ate roasted peacocks, served with their feathers reattached, so it looked majestic and tasted like string. In Tudor England, nobles enjoyed pies stuffed with live birds, which would burst out when the pie was cut open, terrifying the guests and probably ruining the tablecloth, because naturally, the priority wasn't taste, but spectacle. And of course, we can't forget Napoleon, who adored chicken cooked with onions, or Richard II of England, whose court chefs produced cookbooks full of recipes that involved gold leaf, because apparently indigestion wasn't complete unless it also glittered. Which brings us neatly back to the contrast. On one side of history, dusty saloons serving beans. On the other, royal banquets serving swans and gilded pies. Different worlds, same principle. Humans have always found creative ways to make food both fascinating and faintly disappointing. And with that thought, let's drift gently onward into the next round of royal peculiarities. Hey everyone, if you're still awake after all that talk of beans and whiskey, well, congratulations. But tonight isn't only about dusty saloons. No, we're floating back across the ocean into a world of velvet cloaks, brittle crowns, and questionable genetics. Because if there's one thing European monarchies loved, it was keeping things in the family. And by things, I mean marriages, cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and entire dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own. creative definition of romance. So, let's tuck in and drift through some of the most inbred monarchs in European history. A story where the family tree is less a tree and more a very confused shrub. Let's begin with the Habsburgs, because of course we do. No dynasty quite embodied the dangers of genetic recycling like they did. The Habsburgs ruled much of Europe, Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, the Low Countries, and for centuries, their solution to diplomacy was simple: just marry each other. Why waste time making treaties when you can hand your cousin a wedding ring and call it a day? The result was what historians politely call the Habsburg jaw. If you've seen portraits, you know what I mean. Massive, protruding lower jaws, lips that never quite met, and chins that seemed to be competing with each other. The most famous example was Charles II of Spain. Charles, born in 1661. He was the final Habsburg king of Spain, and his family's dedication to inbreeding really showed. His father and mother were uncle and niece, which means Charles' family tree didn't branch, it looped. By the time he was born, his pedigree collapse was so extreme that he had fewer distinct ancestors than the average goat. Charles was sickly, frail, and had the mental development of a child well into adulthood. He suffered seizures, couldn't chew food properly thanks to that jaw, and had a tongue so large he could barely speak clearly. Courtiers, being delicate, described him as of weak constitution, which is one way of saying barely functional. Despite this, Charles was expected to produce an heir. Naturally, he didn't. 2 marriages, 0 children. The Habsburg bloodline in Spain fizzled out with him in 1700, leaving behind both a power vacuum and a cautionary tale about marrying your niece just a little too often. Now, the Habsburgs weren't the only offenders. Let's drift over to the French Bourbons for a moment. They also had their fair share of tangled family branches. Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, married his first cousin, Maria Theresa of Spain. Their union was less about passion and more about diplomacy, but their children, predictably, didn't thrive. Most died young, which was common enough at the time, but didn't exactly help when combined with inbred fragility. And then there was Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Not first cousins, technically, but still very much related through the Habsburg connection. Their tragic end is well known. The French Revolution solved the question of whether their bloodline would continue. Spoiler, it didn't, at least not in France. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because if you thought Charles II of Spain was bad, allow me to introduce you to Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand, born in 1793, was another Habsburg special. His parents were double first cousins, meaning they shared both sets of grandparents. So, Ferdinand had the genetic diversity of a half-finished crossword puzzle. He suffered from epilepsy, water on the brain, and a general inability to rule. When he finally became emperor, the joke was that his advisors had to guide him through basic decisions. He once famously said, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings," which, to be fair, is the most relatable thing a monarch has ever declared. Still, not exactly a ringing endorsement of leadership. Let's drift to England, where inbreeding was slightly less pronounced, but still present. The British royal family had a habit of intermarrying with German cousins. Queen Victoria herself married Prince Albert, who was her first cousin. Their sprawling brood of 9 children went on to marry into nearly every royal house in Europe, which is why Victoria is often called the grandmother of Europe. It all sounds very romantic, until you remember that Victoria and Albert also passed on the gene for hemophilia, a bleeding disorder that turned even minor cuts into life-threatening events. This royal disease, as it was called, spread across European courts. The Russian Tsarevich, Alexei, son of Nicholas II and Alexandra, who was Victoria's granddaughter, suffered from it severely. His illness played a huge role in destabilizing the Romanovs, as his desperate mother turned to a wandering mystic named Rasputin for help. And, well, we all know how that turned out. Let's just say Russian history did not benefit from the combination of hemophilia, desperation, and a bearded man who smelled like pickled garlic. But perhaps the most tragic part of all this wasn't just the illnesses or deformities. It was the obsession with keeping power pure. Marrying outside the family was seen as weakness, as betrayal. So generation after generation, these dynasties folded in on themselves, clinging to crowns even as their bodies gave way. There's something quietly ironic about it. They ruled millions, yet couldn't escape the consequences of their own choices. They could build palaces, commission portraits, and wage wars across continents, but they couldn't solve the simple problem of marrying someone who wasn't a cousin. Of course, not every inbred monarch was tragic. Some were just odd. Take King George III of Britain. He wasn't as inbred as Charles II, but still had a tangled family tree. His bouts of mental illness, what people called madness, were probably due to a medical condition called porphyria, not inbreeding alone. But the image of him talking to trees in Windsor still became part of royal folklore. Or Philip II of Spain, another Habsburg. He married 4 times, 2 of those wives being his own nieces. He was austere, deeply religious, and had the general charisma of a damp sponge. His most famous project, the Spanish Armada, was a spectacular failure. Apparently, even divine favor can't help when your ships are badly designed and your sailors are malnourished on salted fish. And yet, for all the grotesque portraits and tragic stories, these monarchs remain strangely fascinating. They remind us that power doesn't guarantee health, beauty, or even competence. Sometimes, it just guarantees an overgrown chin and a collection of empty cradles. So, as you drift a little deeper into sleep, picture those courts, dimly lit halls, kings slumped in gilded chairs, jaws jutting awkwardly, courtiers whispering about their lack of heirs, queens praying over sickly children, and somewhere in Spain, Charles II trying to chew a piece of meat, wondering why life was so very exhausting. Let's drift onward, because there are plenty more royal fiascos waiting in the shadows. Hey everyone, still awake? That's impressive. If you're half asleep, even better. Tonight, we're easing into another kind of dynastic disaster, marriages. Those carefully arranged, painfully formal unions that promised peace between nations, but more often created only family feuds, sickly heirs, and very passive-aggressive letters between courts. Because in royal circles, you didn't really marry for love. You married for treaties, borders, and occasionally, a nice dowry of sheep. The result was that kings and queens spent their lives in polite, or not so polite, misery with spouses they barely knew, who were often also their cousins. Let's drift into some of the most memorably awful ones. We'll start with Henry VIII of England, because of course we do. Henry's love life was essentially a national sport, complete with beheadings, annulments, and a permanent question mark about why anyone kept saying yes to him. His first marriage, to Catherine of Aragon, seemed reasonable enough. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Good connections, plenty of prestige. But Catherine couldn't give Henry the one thing he desperately wanted, a healthy male heir. She did give him Mary, later Mary I, but Henry saw that as more of a consolation prize. After about 2 decades of marriage, Henry decided he'd had enough. He tried to get the Pope to annul it. The Pope, inconveniently, said no. So Henry solved the problem by breaking England away from the Catholic Church. Naturally, he then married Anne Boleyn, who, spoiler alert, lost her head after also failing to produce a male heir. This is the general theme of Henry's marital resume: 6 wives, countless arguments, 2 executions, and still no lasting male heir. His only son, Edward VI, was sickly and died young, which means all that fussing and chopping heads did very little in the end. But England wasn't alone in its messy marriages. Let's float over to France, where Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette made one of history's most awkward royal couples. Louis was shy, indecisive, and enjoyed hobbies like locksmithing. Yes, he liked making locks, which is charming if you're a village blacksmith, less so if you're running a kingdom. Marie Antoinette, meanwhile, was a teenage Habsburg princess shipped off to Versailles at 14. She liked fashion, parties, and spending money she didn't have. The two of them struggled to even consummate their marriage for years. Louis apparently had some technical difficulties, possibly a medical condition, possibly just nerves. Whatever the cause, Europe gossiped relentlessly about the royal bedchamber. Pamphlets were printed, cartoons were drawn. By the time they finally managed to have children, their public image was so tarnished that revolution was already brewing. It's hard to build public trust when the people think their king can't manage the simplest task of producing an heir. Speaking of Habsburgs, and we always seem to circle back to them, let's remember Joanna of Castile, better known as Joanna the Mad. She married Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy. Handsome might be a stretch, but compared to most inbred royals, he did look reasonably alive. Their union was supposed to cement Spanish Burgundian power. Instead, it gave us one of history's great marital disasters. Joanna adored Philip. Unfortunately, he did not return the sentiment. He was unfaithful constantly, flaunting his affairs in public. Joanna, understandably, became deeply jealous and unstable. After Philip's early death at 28, she refused to let his body go. Quite literally, she traveled around with his corpse for months, opening the coffin to kiss him, convinced he wasn't truly gone. The Spanish court eventually declared her insane and locked her away for the rest of her life. Nearly 50 years. Their marriage, which was supposed to unify kingdoms, instead became a case study in tragic obsession and dynastic collapse. Another tragic pairing comes from Russia, Peter III and Catherine the Great. Peter III was technically German, brought to Russia to continue the Romanov line. He adored Prussia, admired Frederick the Great, and spent his time playing with toy soldiers. He was also, according to most accounts, immature, erratic, and unpleasant. His wife, Catherine, was far more intelligent, ambitious, and politically savvy. Their marriage was a disaster. Peter openly humiliated her, took mistresses, and ignored his duties. Catherine, not one to sit quietly, began plotting. Eventually, she overthrew him in a coup, declared herself Empress of Russia, and ruled successfully for decades. Peter, meanwhile, was quietly disposed of not long after. It's safe to say this was not the romantic union their families had envisioned. Then there's Philip II of Spain and Mary I of England. Their marriage was designed to strengthen Catholic power in Europe. Mary, daughter of Henry VIII, was already unpopular thanks to her attempts to force Catholicism back on Protestant England. Philip was a foreign prince who didn't even speak English. Their union was cold and joyless. Mary was older, desperate for children, and suffered multiple false pregnancies, painful episodes where she believed she was expecting, only for nothing to happen. Philip, meanwhile, spent much of his time abroad, avoiding both Mary and the dreary English climate. When Mary died childless in 1558, England passed to her half-sister Elizabeth I. The marriage had achieved nothing, except adding one more sad chapter to the Habsburg marriage saga. The theme here is fairly consistent. Royal marriages, for all their pageantry and political importance, often left behind only heartache, fragile heirs, or, occasionally, dead husbands. These unions were supposed to keep dynasties strong, but more often they revealed just how fragile those dynasties were. And as we drift further into the night, it's almost soothing to think about how little control even the most powerful people had over their private lives. Kings and queens with crowns and armies, reduced to the same frustrations of bad spouses, family gossip, and awkward dinners. Let's float onward, because next, we'll find something even more quietly tragic: the childhoods of royal heirs, those spoiled, sickly, and often doomed little princes and princesses. Hey everyone, if you're still with me, it might be time to get comfortable, because we're drifting now into the nurseries of Europe's castles, places filled with lace cradles, overbearing tutors, and children who were more symbols than people. Royal childhood was rarely joyful. These weren't kids who got to roll around in mud or steal apples from orchards. They were pawns in a larger dynastic game, and they were usually very sick. Let's begin with the Tudor children, because no one embodies frailty and misfortune quite like them. Take Edward VI, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. He was the long-awaited male heir, the prize Henry had destroyed marriages, churches, and half his friendships to obtain. Edward was crowned at 9 years old. Imagine that, a boy barely taller than his own crown, suddenly responsible for an entire kingdom. But Edward was delicate, pale, and constantly ill. He was pushed around by advisors who treated him less like a boy and more like a particularly fragile chess piece. He ruled for only 6 years before dying at 15, likely from tuberculosis. All of Henry's scheming, all of Anne Boleyn's head losing, all of that fuss for a boy who barely reached his mid-teens. Then there was Mary I, Edward's older half-sister. Her childhood was filled with instability. At one point she was declared illegitimate. At another, she was told she might never marry. She watched her father swap wives like costumes, and her own mother, Catherine of Aragon, was cast aside. Mary grew up anxious, religiously intense, and permanently scarred. It's not surprising she later became known as Bloody Mary. And finally, Elizabeth I, whose childhood was no better. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was not yet 3. She was declared illegitimate, passed around between households, and kept perpetually uncertain about her future. That she grew into a long reigning monarch at all is something of a miracle. Now, let's drift over to the French Valois children, who practically lived in a revolving door of illness and disaster. One of the most striking was Charles VI, known later as Charles the Mad. As a boy, he was already fragile and prone to fits. His childhood was a blur of tutors and expectations, as his father Charles V hoped desperately to mold him into a capable heir. Instead, Charles VI grew into a man who suffered bouts of insanity so severe he sometimes believed he was made of glass. He ordered his attendants not to touch him for fear he would shatter. Not the most reassuring quality in a medieval king. And then there was Francis II, who married Mary, Queen of Scots. At the ripe age of 14, he was already sickly, undersized, and prone to ear infections. Francis died at just 16, leaving behind a widow barely older than he was, who had to return to Scotland with her future uncertain. Another royal childhood cut brutally short. Of course, no discussion of doomed children would be complete without the Habsburgs. Take Charles II of Spain, often considered the most inbred king in European history. His childhood was a tragedy in slow motion. Born with severe physical and mental disabilities, Charles was unable to walk or speak properly for much of his life. His jaw was so misshapen from centuries of inbreeding that he could barely chew food. As a boy, he was treated as both sacred and pitiful. Courtiers whispered about his health constantly. Priests prayed over him daily, and doctors tried every odd treatment imaginable. Leeches, holy relics, strange diets. Nothing worked. By adulthood, Charles was infertile, plagued with illnesses, and mentally unstable. His childhood was essentially a long rehearsal for the disastrous reign that followed. Let's pause and consider the role of tutors in these lives. Imagine being 6 years old and instead of playing outside, you're forced to sit for hours memorizing genealogies or Latin prayers. Tutors were strict, and punishments were harsh. Many royal children grew up terrified of failure, their natural childhood joy crushed under the weight of dynastic responsibility. For instance, Louis XIII of France had a childhood filled with scoldings from Cardinal Richelieu and constant fear of letting down his father, Henry IV. He grew into a man plagued with insecurity, paranoia, and a general sense of being unworthy. His childhood wounds never healed. And then there's the odd category of spoiled royal children. Not sick, but warped by overindulgence. Take Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King. As a boy, he was lavished with attention after surviving smallpox. He was taught from the cradle that he was God's representative on earth. By adulthood, he believed it wholeheartedly. His childhood of pampering turned him into one of history's most gloriously arrogant monarchs. Versailles was essentially a very expensive extension of his nursery. Or consider Ivan the Terrible of Russia. His childhood was anything but nurturing. He was neglected, beaten, and left to roam Moscow's streets while rival boyars fought for power. He grew up angry, suspicious, and cruel. By adulthood, His paranoia manifested in violent purges and public executions. A miserable childhood turned into a terrifying reign. It's worth remembering that medieval medicine didn't help. Most royal children were dosed with concoctions that did more harm than good. Mercury, lead, ground pearls, you name it, they swallowed it. Healthy remedies often ensured that even if the child wasn't born sickly, they'd grow into it. And as we drift back from these royal nurseries, we can see the pattern. Childhood, which should be the simplest and happiest part of life, was for these heirs a carefully controlled prison. Surrounded by anxious tutors, power-hungry courtiers, and hopeless doctors, they rarely had a chance at normalcy. Whether spoiled into arrogance or broken into fragility, their childhoods shaped dynasties and often doomed them. So the next time you picture a medieval prince in golden robes, remember the child beneath them, coughing, nervous, and wishing he could just go outside and play. Let's drift on gently now, because next, we'll wander into the royal kitchens and feasting halls, where spoiled princes grew into spoiled men, and where banquet tables sagged under the weight of meat, mead, and occasional chaos.